Oi, oi, it's your boy Pro. This time I'm back with another episode of Semi-Pro. It's Hawka. He's a big brain analyst from the UK scene. He's known for his YouTube content, a good bit of commentary as well recently on that DreamHack grind. You may have noticed. If you didn't notice, you're missing out. So welcome, of course, Hawka, to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing good, thanks. I appreciate that intro as well. I've been trying to switch it up a bit with my intros recently, but sometimes you just got to go with it.
Sometimes you got to go with the classic. I was curious, actually, having watched the last couple of your videos, and I noticed that Oi Oi was conspicuously absent. Do you have a bit of a backstory as a nice layup question for you at the beginning here?
No, nothing really. I just like switching it up every now and then, just saying like whatever comes to mind, something dumb. Like it's yeah, it's it really. Not much to it.
Gotcha. So speaking of some of the content that has been happening in the YouTube space, we've seen yourself with your classic demo reviews where you take a look at some of the pro scene, and of course Launders has been coming in hot in the game recently, doing some stuff every day now. There's been quite an influx of analytical content, I would say, which is great for me because I'm not quite tenured in the scene enough to be able to make my own analyses and really be confident in them. So a lot of the time I like to just see what other people who are the big brains of the scene really think and how they present their ideas. So one of the things that I had initially talked about before we even got started with this was your video with Bymass in FaZe versus how he was used in mouse sports more recently. And as a bit of a teaser for that video, so if anybody here who's watching this interview has not seen that video, they can jump over to it after they finish this one. I was curious as to sort of what the jumping off point for that particular video was. Like, did you just see something in the games where Bymass was used by mouse sports differently that like made you remember how much of a drastic difference was there? Some sort of dead ringer when it came to the differences between Bymass in FaZe and Bymass in mouse sports, or was it just something that you thought might have been an interesting idea to explore, and then you like looked at it and found some content out of it?
Yeah, that's generally how it goes. I think normally it's just anything that I think is sort of decently interesting. What's been going on in the scene recently? I think there had been a fair amount of discussion about Bimass as well. The first thing for me is at first I did a couple of demo reviews on him when he was just in FaZe Clan, because to me it's always insane how like in CS you can just have some dude basically who's just been playing on FPL and he just gets picked up by FaZe. Like that would never happen in like any other, traditional sport, right? You're not exactly going to see like Messi going down to the park and being like, this kid's pretty good. I've played against him in some pickup games. I'm going to sign him to Barcelona, right? So at first it was looking at how he was doing in FaZe. I picked out a couple of those demos. And then I think it was specifically on Nuke. I noticed that when he moved to Mouse, his ratings were getting a lot better. Like he had a game recently where he went like 29 for 9 on Nuke. So at first I just looked at how he was doing on Mouse and Nuke. And then I looked at a couple of other maps and then just kind of compared the spots he was playing, what he was doing well, what wasn't working. It's just basically whatever I think is interesting in the scene right now, right? And sometimes I'll use stats to show that. Sometimes it would just be storylines based on what's actually happening kind of on the streams.
Well, another big example of you using stats was I remember when you had one of your big art breakout videos where you looked at Furia specifically, and you were looking at like how aggressive art was, and you actually plotted it on a graph, and there was that line of yours where the only person who even comes second to art is Art himself, like last year or something. So just a really like good way to use stats to like really sell the point, or at least like create a question that you then explore with the rest of the video. So I thought that was a nice way to like sort of parlay the average fan's sort of appreciation for stats into something where they could go a little bit deeper, and like you're bringing them along with you to the story essentially to really get the meat out of it. So when you're sitting down to take a look at somebody like Bymass, somebody like Art, or somebody basically just any old player of any old team, is there a certain formula that you end up following? Like, do you actually look at their stats before you even get into it? Or, in the case of Bymass, you said that you were somewhat familiar with his play because you looked at him in FaZe, and then you saw, oh, there's a stat increase, and that made you, ask some questions that you just wanted to answer, and that's essentially the thrust of the video. So is that like the normal way that goes about, or is there another trick up your sleeve in terms of like how you mine certain pro games or tournaments or whatever for content themselves?
So sometimes it will just be watching the pro games and seeing, generally that's for more overall strats, I would say. If there's something really cool there that I see that's going on, I'll break that down. I haven't done that as much recently, actually, because recently I've been much more focusing on the opening kill stuff, because I just find that super interesting, because you can go into, for specific maps, you can look at like CT side, who's trying the opening kill the most. And then you can kind of see, okay, what spot are they playing? What are they doing? That's what I did with my Brolan video recently, where he kind of pushes around the A site a lot. So that's what I've been focused on more recently. With the art one, it was more just, this guy is such a crazy outlier that you have to talk about him. I think for that, I took a lot of inspiration from, I don't know if you watch NBA YouTubers, but there's a guy called Jimmy High Roller who does some videos kind of like that, where he's basically like showing, hey, look, this guy is a ridiculous outlier in this aspect of the game. He does it a lot with, I think, James Harden, who gets fouled a lot and gets a lot of free throws, for example. So I think that's a really good way of when someone's that big of an outlier, I think that's something the casual fan can pick up on so much more easily. And that's kind of what I was hoping to do with that art video, right? I think there are some videos that are going to be more focused on more in-depth stuff, more things that actual sort of Counter-Strike nerds, as I would call them, want to go into. But I think that the thing that Counter-Strike has that it's really lacking is the ability for video content to draw in the casual viewer to the esport. I
Yes.
think that's something on YouTube that really we need more of, because this game is great. And I think if you just get that little hook to draw you in, like maybe you do go and watch a game and you see the art's playing, and now you wanna see what he's doing, right? So I think that's kind of where I want to go more with my YouTube content, if I can find more ideas that work like that.
Since I don't think it'll be a particularly long tangent, I did want to go down the rabbit hole of asking you what kind of influences you have outside of esports, because you did just mention that NBA YouTuber. And while I'm not personally familiar with a lot of the traditional sports content out there, I'm sure there's a lot of examples of that supplementary content that really helps fuel the general fans' interest in the game. Like if they're a fan of a certain team, they'll go look up, maybe breakdowns of a certain match, or they'll stay to watch the official broadcast sort of recap in that sense, because that, of course, that happens on a more traditional TV medium. But especially as more and more people are turning to social media and other kinds of, different platforms for content, essentially like YouTube, there's going to be more of an interest coming out of traditional sports. What would be some of the more interesting influences that you've had based on that traditional sports metric, or just outside of esports anyway? It doesn't even have to be necessarily traditional sports, but what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say kind of similar in that a fair bit of it would be to do with YouTube content. So for me, for example, oh, I've hit my mic. For me, for example, I personally recently got back into watching the NBA through watching these YouTubers. So for me, it would be like I'd watch one of those Jimmy High Roller videos I was talking about. And then there's more in-depth ones. There's a channel called Thinking Basketball, which is so good for this. He does amazing breakdowns of sort of the actual plays that are being run and how the teams are constantly adapting to each other. Like he does really amazing stuff that I think honestly you should be seeing on the NBA broadcasts almost. So for me, that's what I look at, and that's what I want to kind of do for Counter-Strike overall, right? Like I think that the nice thing about traditional sports like basketball are that they kind of already have that vague interest from people, right? People know what basketball is. I almost feel like there is a similar aspect of that in Counter-Strike, where a lot of video game players know of CS. They at least know it well enough, and it's intuitive enough to watch, where maybe if you get recommended some random Counter-Strike video that's more for drawing casuals into the game and specifically to the esports side of things, they can actually take that and it can help grow the game. So for me, that's the kind of stuff I'm looking at. In terms of other influences, I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess I have kind of a wide range of stuff for somewhat for casting as well. Like I've been into poker a fair bit. I think quite a few of those concepts can carry over. So there's a couple of other interests, I guess, that kind of mesh. But specifically for my YouTube stuff, the great thing about Counter-Strike is, to anyone watching at home, you can just take video ideas from other games, from other sports even. You can just do them for Counter-Strike. Like you can, because I think Counter-Strike content has been lacking for so long. And like you said, now Launders is coming back into it. It feels like there is that push into more analytical content. And I actually credit Thorin a lot for that. Thorin is someone who is pushing that content into the brains of people, right? Into the atmosphere, you could say. So that now people are seeing that this content is wanted and it is going to be rewarded. And now I'm starting to see, like, there are a couple of other guys like Mahone who are starting to get into it more. There are a couple of these people who are only making these videos who are starting to do it. So I think that culture shift seems to be starting to happen, which is great.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I just had as a sort of last point on this particular topic was if you had any people who I mean, this could also extend to casting, of course, but any people who are more endemic to the scene, sort of the inverse of the previous question, where you looked at what they were doing and within the Counter-Strike scene itself and said, well, I could do something similar to that, or I could take some sort of lesson for that. Would you have anybody to credit with some sort of influence in that nature?
I think the obvious one would probably be just Elmer Puddy, who was the first one who I think really got big from doing analytical stuff. And occasionally I will get people commenting like, hey, this is kind of like Elmer Puddy's stuff. And I think to me that's a compliment because they've been missing that and they're starting to get that from other people. I think Launders is also really good for that similar style of content. Launders is obviously a bit longer form, which I think is good. Like, I actually think it's really good to show a whole half or a whole demo at times because it helps contextualize everything. Whereas sometimes I always worry that if I only show the good moments of a player, you kind of bias them, right? You kind of bias someone into thinking, "Wow, this is the best player ever," when maybe he's not. So there's definitely good things about Launder's style of content as well. But yeah, I'd say Elmer Putty was the obvious one in that sense.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Alma Putty specifically. As we all know, he's been moved onto a coaching role. And my next question is actually going to be about coaching in general, because one thing that has felt like an intangible for a really long time, in a way that really isn't the case for and admittedly, I follow natural sports or default sports, traditional sports in a very casual manner. So maybe I'm also overvaluing how they handle it. But the impact of coaching specifically has felt like something where people can pretty much only speculate when it comes to the water cooler of the internet, as it were, when it comes to Counter-Strike, people on Reddit or people in Twitter replies or whatever, wherever you're finding your discussion with the average layman, it tends to just be speculation. It tends to be, well, based on what I think or based on what I feel. It's really hard for somebody who values a more empirical approach to look at that and say, well, what can I actually learn from this exchange, or what can I take away from this that can help, build my own understanding of how teams are structured or how this particular coach worked in this particular team. And it's somewhat similar in terms of the video that you made for Bimas, which, in the way that you're dealing with Kerrigan, which is a different IGL and not a coach, but it's a completely different structure in a way. So how would you go about the approach? And admittedly, it's not an easy question, but how would you go about actually tackling the job of evaluating an IGL or a coach or some sort of team structure in a player's performance? Is there any particular things or strategies that you would have to employ in order to properly set that up? Or do you think that there's just an obvious approach that people are missing? Because most of the time I see, again, content that's built around emotions or feelings or just gut reactions, and really less so about stats.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you gave me some softballs to begin with. Now we get into the real
Of
questions,
course,
which I
yeah.
appreciate. It definitely is difficult. I mean, the traditional thing that everyone's done to kind of look at how good a coach is just, can they do well on different teams is normally how you look at it. So if a coach joins a team and all of a sudden they get way better, you can assume they're probably at least a pretty good coach, right? Or at least they're a good fit on that team. I think it is especially hard to look at when you're making content. Like, I can't say who's doing what on this team, right? Like, Carrigan recently has come out in an interview and basically said he is kind of micromanaging BMAS, which is very helpful to hear. But a lot of teams just don't do that. A lot of scenes just don't do those interviews. So a lot of it is trying to just consume as much content as you can, try and just hear from the players as much as you can. Some of it is just you're kind of having to do guesswork. So yeah, I don't know if there is a really good answer for this, because you also have to think a lot of the times, I think we always look at teams and we kind of picture them in our heads as, oh, well, the IGL is almost always making the calls. That's not even true sometimes, right? Like, sometimes there are players who are just going to have a gut feeling for something and they're going to say, let's do this round, right? Or maybe the comms are off in a round and that's why someone makes a peak that looks weird. There are so many intangibles and things that we just can't really know, which I think in traditional sports are slightly different in that we do have more access, I feel like, to the
Yes.
coaches, right? There are sometimes even things in like the backroom lockers where you get to see what's going on. You get better interviews with the coaches, that they'll actually be able to talk more. I think that's partly because in Counter-Strike, there's always another tournament around the corner. Whereas in like the NBA, once it's done, right? It's done for that season. So that's probably part of the reason why it's quite difficult to know exactly what's going on.
Well, the dream from a fan's perspective would be that every single halftime gets called, or every single timeout that gets called, you hear the coaches talking back and forth, and you hear the comms there, and that's broadcasted live to however many viewers. But the honor system has to come into play there, and you're like, well, is this really going to be reasonable? All my strats are going to get leaked or whatever. Like, you've got to kind of balance the two in that sense. One thing that was kind of interesting is somewhat recently, the Blast had a LAN tournament. Well, it's not super recent because it's LAN, but they had that LAN tournament where Complexity shined and Navi looked really killer. And of course, one of the things that kept coming out of that particular event was the fact that the broadcast talent actually had access to the team comms during the match. They could opt to listen in during that sort of match. So the question then is like, would there be some sort of compromise where you're dealing with trusted individuals who are part of the broadcast talent at some of these events? Maybe if you get signed on as a commentator or something to that effect, you might have to sign some sort of legally binding document, perhaps, and some sort of thing that says basically, I accept responsibility if this leaks and it comes back and it's, oh, I was the one who leaked these comms, then I have to face some sort of penalty. But otherwise, just by virtue of being on the broadcast talent or being a certain level of analyst or something, you're able to access the team comms and make some determinations about IGLs based on that. Would that really help that much for content in this sense? Or like, in a way, you still have to basically go off of the honor system by publishing content about that, by saying, when I listened to the comms here, I found out this. And for the most part, it seems like that kind of experience has mostly been shared with anecdotes on broadcasts or on talk shows where, for example, Thorin will say something about the comms of Team Liquid being a mess at that Blast event. And really, we only have his word to go on. Obviously, there's no reason for him to lie about that particular thing. But in a way where it's not even really possible to be made transparent to the average fan, would it really be that much more beneficial? Do you still think it would give you some sort of insight where you could at least make some predictions or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty helpful to. I think, like you said, the best way to do it is to give it to maybe broadcast talent, and then they can say anecdotes and they can go as far as they need to on that, and they can kind of give you a rough idea on what's going on. I think personally, obviously, I'd love to be able to listen into that. I know that I think it was Maui and Thorin who talked about this at some point, where Maui Snake said he was so jealous that was the thing that Thorin had been able to listen to.
Yeah.
Because it's really useful to be able to get a rough idea of why rounds are going wrong, right? If you see a team that's always getting close to the wins and then choking, you can kind of hear maybe the comms start to get flustered or whatever. So it's something that would be very, very helpful. The obvious thing as well, I think, that holds Counter-Strike back in this aspect is that a lot of traditional sports, at least American sports, are just all going to be in English in terms of the teams. That's not the case for Counter-Strike, right? So Danish teams, maybe you're not going to be able to hear their comms as clearly. So I think teams are starting to open up a bit more to it, because you do start to see more videos on the team's channels where they're posting some rounds, some specific moments. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future we get more of an insight into this. But for now, yeah, it's kind of not quite guesswork, but educated guesswork, I guess.
Now, when it comes to the IGL's particular role in molding players, you referenced earlier Kerrigan saying that he was micromanaging Bimus. In a case where you're dealing with something that's that, I guess you could call it extreme in a way, where you've got one particular player in a game saying exactly where the other player needs to go. It's easy to take points away from Bemis in that particular case and give points to Kerrigan or something like that. But again, we need that information to really make that judgment call. Is there a case that you can think of recently where you've seen a player join a new roster or an IGL join a new roster, and suddenly like things transform relatively heavily, and you can clearly see like it was this player, like predicated on this player's role or this player's actions? Like, how do you really draw the line between giving bonus points, giving credit to one player over another, or the IGL over the star player, or something like that? Like, that's something that's quite been quite in contention among fans, especially in the old FaZe Clan era, where they had obviously Kerrigan and then the 4 fraggers. That was the narrative that was spun around, and his strats were just Nico go kill or whatever. So like, obviously it can't be that extreme, especially since we've seen FaZe's decline since Kerrigan's left. But how would you go about trying to split credit between players in that sense? Is that just another impossible task for content creators?
I think it kind of is to an extent, but there are also times where, when Hunden, for example, has been so good throughout his career at coming into teams and putting players in the right roles and literally building teams. Like the Mad Lions team, he did basically build, right? I actually got to ask him this at the after party of a tournament once, and he said, like, yeah, I specifically did, because it was the case where Hunden joined, and then 1 month later, another player joined, and then 1 month later, another player joined. So in that case, you can kind of see, okay, he's like scouting out players and finding who's going to fit each role. And even in Heroic now, I just look at these players and they've never been able to consistently be at this sort of top level, right? So I think Hunden has to have a lot of say there. I also think some of the stuff they're doing is very different, which is why I assume it's Hunden who's probably got a big part in that. But yeah, it's kind of the same. I mean, I look at Vitality, for example. Another way you can do it is when Alex left Vitality, a lot of people were wondering, will they drop off? But they didn't drop off. They're still at a pretty good level. And sure, that probably means Apex is definitely at least a good IGL. But the one constant there is their coach. I never know how to pronounce his name.
I think it's Xtaz, but I'm not sure
either.
Yeah,
Xtaz, that's it. Yeah, clearly he has to be doing something right as well. So it is just kind of guesswork, but that's the best we got, sadly.
So what I'm gathering here anyway so far is that if you really want to accurately assess the career trajectory or the impact of a player or coach throughout their career, when it comes to like leading the team itself, be it IGL or coach, you kind of have to wait to see their track record unfold in front of you. And until then, is there a way that you might be able to spot out like rising stars in those particular roles? It's obviously easy to say that when you've got a star fragger and he's ripping people's heads off no matter what the skill level is. Like obviously an extreme example would be Zywoo when he was coming up, but just in general, when you've got like pretty decent aim stars, it's much easier to look at their impact and say, okay, this guy's the real deal. Like he's able to compete at this level, at least in this particular team structure. You know, he's not falling apart motivationally, and he's still hitting his shots. That's pretty much all we need from a star player in that particular sense. But it does seem like yet another impossible task is to really pick out the rising stars in those particular examples. And this is something that especially North American CS desperately needs right now. They desperately need rising star IGLs. So if there's any way that we can possibly be on the lookout for that, what would you say to that as far as trying to pick out the few people who would be gifted enough to lead at a world-class level?
I think one of the good ways of doing it, and one of the things that's been good recently, is having people like Maui Snake who really have their ear to the ground, and then having them start to get in contact with people like Thorin who can maybe actually help push these guys. Like if Maui really thinks there's a really good IGL at the tier 2, tier 3 NA scene, he can probably go to Thorin and say, hey, I'd like to try and push for this guy to get a chance in a better team, right? Even if it's just a tryout, that can make a huge difference. So that's one thing I'll say. The other thing is, the other problem I think is in those lower tier teams, I'm going to be honest, half the time, I don't even know who the IGL is. Like there are some teams where you will consistently have the IGL. Like I know, I'm going to talk about the UK scene here, which is still pretty much irrelevant. But I know for Mezzy, for example, he's always come up with the same IGL that is Adam. And we're finally having an IGL in the UK who can maybe foster that talent, who I know is sticking to the IGL role. But in the past, it was never really like that. So that's the other thing is I think teams need to kind of come out and tell us at these lower levels. Like we need to know who is the IGL for this period, who's doing what. Because I was thinking about trying to make a document, like keeping track of who's leading for each team at these lower levels. And then maybe you can see, oh, well, this guy switched to leading like a few months ago, and now they've got way better. But it's just so hard to do, especially in Europe where you've got so many teams and so many scenes and such a deep scene.
Well, I think that does it for the IGL questions anyway, because one of course, the big issues right now is actually with the game itself, I would say, and less so to do with IGL specifically. We are seeing a bit of a drought in talent. I did want to ask you about one of the videos you put out a little bit longer ago, which was, I think you titled it like the biggest problem Counter-Strike has right now. And it was about, you used the example of a pro match where you had one team, the T team, losing the first pistol round, but they had a bomb plant, and so they were able to buy a better buy than the CTs, who won the pistol round by defusing the bomb. And obviously, this is something where when the economy changes originally rolled out, there was a pretty decent outcry. People were saying this is probably too heavy-handed from Valve. They're trying too many gimmicks to make pistol rounds still viable, but not have the same sort of thing happen as the old Counter-Strike, where in the old economy system you could just get money fucked after losing a force buy or something like that, or you win one round, lose one round, and suddenly you're screwed. And it felt like maybe some people, it seemed anyway, it felt like Valve was doing a little bit too much in the gimmick territory to try to like force this sort of gameplay to potentially be possible, without necessarily like just assessing the root problem, which is something to do with like maybe bomb plant returns or some lack of money making potential for counter terrorists or something in that effect. So the long and the short of it is that the fact that Ts can get a better buy than CTs, it seems to continue to be the trend right now, even after losing by bomb defusal. Do you think that this is still the biggest problem that Counter-Strike has at the pro level?
Yeah, you got to get the clickbait in there, right? You got to go for those sorts of
Yeah, of
titles.
course.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I would probably say the biggest problem is not being able to have lands, right? Like, that's
True.
probably actually the biggest problem. But you got to sell the video. Marketing is a lot of what YouTube is, honestly, just trying to sell the video to people.
As far as like actual central issues that the game developers are responsible for when it comes to like the game itself, the game rules or so, would that actually total up as the biggest issue in your mind?
Yeah, I'm still not a massive fan of the new economy system. It just feels like it, especially in those second rounds. The thing is, I genuinely think, and I'm genuinely surprised, we haven't seen teams purposefully lose pistol rounds at points. I honestly think there is an argument to be made that if you're on the CT side, if you can survive with like 4 or 5 players with Kevlar and defuse the bomb, it might actually be better to do that. Because in that video, I showed an example of, I think it was Heroic doing this, where they basically made sure the bomb could go down. And I can't remember the specifics, but basically the thing that really frustrates me is I genuinely think there are probably situations where it benefits you to lose the pistol round. Like, I actually do think that this is something that teams could experiment with and could think about in the future. And that scares me because I do not want there to be a meta ever where you are purposely losing rounds. That's the first thing that scares me. The second thing that annoys me about this is that the amount of comments I see on that video of people saying, but both teams get to do it, so it's okay, right? It's fair. And it's like, I mean, yeah, okay, it's fair. It's not fun to watch, though, is it? It's not fun to see this second round force spy come out where this team has a bunch of AKs. And the other issue is just like I was saying, that the inherent ability for Ts to just stick together and just group up and be able to trade and just keep those AKs. It's more, I think, just a pet peeve for me. It's probably not the biggest problem. It's probably not the biggest deal in the world, but it just frustrates me to see it, I guess, is what I'd put it down to.
To your point about the meta or potential meta where teams would be deliberately losing, I think to underscore why that would be so bad, generally speaking, is that you are rewarding, in essence, poor play, because the objective should be to win the round. And if you're being rewarded disproportionately for losing it, I mean, that's obviously not really great. So I guess to the point would be, if you can plant the bomb, kill a couple of CTs, and then evacuate with all 5 surviving with Kevlar or whatever, that would obviously be a pretty good situation, because then you don't have to rebuy the Kevlar necessarily, or if you you might be damaged a little bit, but you can just get like the free helmet or 350 helmet. Then you get the AKs, then you get a little bit of utility, and they've just got what, FAMAS, MP9, maybe some a Deagle or Scout or something. They're under equipped, so they actually won the round but have the worst buy. And just the idea, I mean, this is something that we can also explore generally speaking, because the current balance is such that I've seen a lot of pro teams for admittedly a long amount of time now abusing the fact that since AKs one-shot your head anyway, or Deagles one-shot your head anyway, you might as well not even buy head armor as CTs a lot of the times, if you're expecting a full gun round, because ops obviously just go right through it anyway too. So like, there's not really much of a purpose. Now we are seeing more T teams, it seems, use the the Mac 10 to run out and punish that lack of head armor, generally speaking, because it makes that gun a lot more lethal. And now CTs really have nowhere to hide, economically speaking. They've got no corners that they can cut anymore, so it seems. So not necessarily your forte as far as like game balance is concerned, but would you see a potential fix or a potential maybe source problem that we could look at and say, if we can address this somehow, we might be able to turn the tide of this economic woe that we're feeling right now? In general, like, how would you go about sort of trying to rectify this issue, or what issues do you think might contribute to it more that people are not really looking at?
Yeah, it's difficult because for this sort of thing, there's just so much you have to think about when redoing the money system. I think that there are just kind of band-aid fixes you could go for quickly. Like, if you just wanted to lower the price of a few things on the CT side, you could do that. Like, I don't know, make kits $200, right? You could make incendiaries cheaper. You could do all these things if you wanted to. The problem is always going to be, if I try and come up with something right now that's completely planned, I'm sure someone in the comments will be able to pick all sorts of holes in it. I'm sure there'll be all sorts of problems. So it's obviously hard. I'm not saying that Valve, are really missing out on an obvious fix or anything. it's just something that it has got to be looked at, right? It's got to be something that is looked at down the line. So I wouldn't say I have anything that instantly strikes me as being like this is 100% something that needs to change. It's just something that they've got to look at, I guess, on the whole and figure out.
Well, as long as we have this sort of deny the plant meta or attempt to deny the plant meta, I did want to pick your brains about which pro teams you think have adapted to it the best. Because obviously we've got a lot of examples now with all of the crazy amounts of online play and the saturation in the current tournament scene. We've seen a lot of games in this meta, and a lot of different teams in terms of their styles have been showcased. So the question then is, which teams have do you, in your opinion, do you think have adapted the best to the fact that now we're working with this money system? It's been a few months to maybe a year now since it shipped, so we've got a decent amount of experience with it. Which teams have come up on top in that kind of environment?
I'm definitely looking straight at Heroic because I think they're just doing very interesting things with the way they're stacking bomb sites sometimes. Not only can it work where if you stack like 4 players on a site that you just shut down the round, but you can just save. And I specifically said this, I think, on the Maui Snake podcast, is that I specifically think they do it in rounds where it really makes sense, where they are maybe in the first gun round of a half, for example, and they kind of need to be able to build up that money. So I'd look at Heroic for this sort of thing. Other teams, I think most teams have adapted by now, just generally, but I think Astralis always are kind of ahead of the curve on most of these things, right? That they're a good team for it. But I really want to see if Heroic can continue to find this success going forwards with some of the stuff they're doing, because I think they're one of the teams that actually kind of quietly are being more creative than a lot of people maybe are giving them credit for, specifically with those CT setups. And I have seen it work like a surprising amount of the time, where they'll take some big gamble at the start of the round because they kind of know, okay, well, we want to be able to try and deny that plant. So if we just stack this site, this could be a good way of doing it. And obviously they're not doing it all the time, but the rounds they are doing it, I think I see it work for them more often than not, which is definitely something to look at.
Are there any other examples of maybe that particular team, Heroic, or any other team that you've seen that pull off some particularly strange tactic that somehow seems to work? It could be facilitated by the money system, or it could just be something completely different, but just something that you've noticed as far as a trend goes in the current meta that we're experiencing.
I guess I can just say the fact that Art can just push everything on Vertigo and it works
Classic.
for him. Because I was even watching the podcast recently with Apex that Thorin did, and they were basically describing that most teams don't really have that same option for CT aggression. That they were actually thinking of it as more of a map like Inferno, where there's maybe one spot you can push at A ramp and that's it. But Art literally does it where he'll push mid, he'll push B stairs with an AWP, he'll just jump down. He's someone who's definitely kind of changing that map in a sense. I also think just in general, something that is very interesting with Furia is I wonder what they look like if Vertigo wasn't added to the map pool, because it's become a really important map for them. And it is that the map that's been added that's very different to a lot of traditional Counter-Strike maps, in that it probably suits a lot of Furia's strengths. Like Art is very good at AWPing in close range fights like that, where he can just push into the B stairs on Vertigo and get kills like 5 meters away from the other guy. So that's a sort of skill set which most traditional Counter-Strike players just aren't going to have. Because if you're playing Dust 2, why do I need to AWP a guy that's like 2 meters away from me? I don't need to do that. I'm just going to go A long and just snipe at A long. So that's something I think that's really cool about Vertigo, is that it brings that sort of ability to promote guys that can AWP at close range, right? He's basically using it like a shotgun at times.
Well, don't tell Valve that. They might nerf the movement speed or something again. You never know. But as far as Art goes, I mean, that whole Furia team, I feel like, has been in some ways, like you're saying, especially on Vertigo, in a way meta-defining, or at least they define some aspect of it. Obviously, the headlines were aflush with news of the boost that they had discovered over on the A site. Vertigo's a weird map because, like, I'm very much an enthusiast in custom maps, or just maps in general, especially in Counter-Strike. I feel like there's a lot of potential that has just been untapped there. Would love to see like some of the top teams really practice a couple of the maps that have been like lurking under the surface, where the mapping enthusiasts know about them, but they're not really fully aware in the public consciousness. And obviously they haven't been added to the pool in any capacity. But if they could spend like 3 months or 6 months or something, just studying one of those maps, it's a mad sort of request. Obviously, it would never happen. But the idea of it is very tantalizing to me because I've seen some maps that have a lot of potential for that. And in Vertigo, it feels like Valve is just like looking at all of a sea of potential and saying, yeah, but none of them are mine though. And so they stuffed Vertigo in. And of course, on launch, it was a disaster, and they've changed the map up so many times. Like, it felt like once a month or twice a month, they would just make some very radical changes before settling on the current version. But now that we seem to have something of a stable version of Vertigo, and all these months later, how do you feel like, teams have actually adapted to this current layout? You've got the ladder room that was added a little bit ago. You got that corridor between like the bottom floor that the T's start on that can get you into the A ramp or to the B ramp. Is it reasonable for Vertigo itself to have this situation where it seems like the B bomb site is forever like the redheaded stepchild? Nobody ever goes there unless everybody is on A already and they somehow have that info. What are your thoughts generally speaking on Vertigo and how teams have taken to it in the pro scene?
Yeah, I do personally feel like that there probably is more of an ability for teams to use mid and B. I think mid specifically is a weird one because I've seen a lot of, especially in NA, teams rarely seem to use it. But I've also seen people talk about mid and I don't know if I see the same things that they're seeing sometimes. They seem to feel like you can only go for mid control and you can't really have the ability to set up nades as easily. I think specifically, especially on the pistol rounds, it's really easy to actually push up mid and split the B site. I think a lot of teams should be doing that more. I think there's a couple of good lineups. NiP are one of the teams who I think are actually pretty good at using mid. I've also seen Heroic recently start to run some strats where they have a smoke for CT and then sort of a molly for that construction position. And then sometimes they are actually kind of flanking onto the A site and finding some success with that. I think that the problem that obviously pros seem to have with it is it's quite a tight choke point. So as soon as you start getting counter nades against you from the T side, it can become an issue. The other problem is A ramp control is so important on this map. It's so important to have that ramp control on Vertigo. And the issue is if you get A ramp control and try and go back to B, you have to walk the entire time, right? You cannot make noise there or they're just going to hear you the whole way. So the only way you can try and maybe fake A and go back to B is if you have like 2 or 3 people selling the fake on A and you already have some people ready to take the B site. And I think there is more of an ability for teams to do that. I think that's something that Astralis did against Heroic, I believe. In their best of 3, they started going A bunch. It didn't work. And then they did adapt and they were able to get A ramp. They were able to pressure that side of the map. And then they had those 2 players waiting at B. Because if it is just that one B anchor, you can actually take him down pretty easily, right? You can probably molly out one position, you can smoke onto the site, and you can actually get the bomb down. The other worry I have with the B site is I'm not sure if it's that good in post plants, is the other thing I kind of get worried about at times. I almost feel like you have to have players pushed up towards that sort of construction CT area, because playing it back from the stairs, if the CTs have just a bit of utility, can be really difficult. So that's the other issue I maybe have with the B site. But for me, the biggest problem with the map is probably still A. I think something needs to change in that it probably just needs to be opened up a little bit, because 2 smokes just to get onto the site seems a little too easy to me.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at pretty much any other bomb site in the game, it's always requires a little bit more of a sort of either risk by not smoking something off or not using some piece of utility, or just an investment of actually using that utility from the T side. And in the same way, it's not even that, maybe it's like Nuke outside where you have to throw in like a whole set piece of 3-4 smokes to actually get something. It's also that for the most part, when it comes to these bomb sites, it does feel like there's more opportunities for the CTs to like, okay, throw some counter utility, fall back, throw some more counter utility, fall back. And then, maybe 2 or 3 segments into that pattern, you're on the side and you can't fall back anymore. And, if the T's successfully take that area, they've done it. But obviously the contact points on Vertigo, generally speaking, are very binary, you could say. So like the other thing, I guess, when it comes to B site specifically or mid, is that like the connection between B and mid has changed so many different times down its iterations. It feels like now that the connection into B is further back in mid, maybe that's what's disincentivized some teams to go in and say like, all right, well, if I can't just jump across on the left after smoking off to the right, now I've got to go all the way almost towards CT basically in order to get to the site. It sort of disincentivized that sort of thing. Another thing that you brought up was, of course, the fact that information is so easy to gather. Like, there's almost no investment required to, hear somebody who's footstepping somewhere, loud walking. So if they're in a situation where, there's only a few alive, it's a broken round situation, they're going to be in a pretty good position to figure out where the team is going, unless they're going slow, and they probably can't do that if the time has already lapsed to 30 seconds or something. So generally speaking, when it comes to newer maps, and we don't get the opportunity to assess them very often in Counter-Strike, and a repetitive question in the scene generally is like, how should we handle this sort of thing? Should Valve add new maps? Should they expand the map pool to a bigger one? In a situation like, a hypothetical, Hawka's been brought on by Valve, and they say, you know what, we're just tired of dealing with this map situation. So you do whatever you want, and you take the blame for anything that goes wrong. What would you do in a situation like that? You calling in some favors and getting some maps swapped out? You going back to existing maps? You expanding the map pool to encompass more than just the 7? What would your take be to get the most exciting but also still competent level Counter-Strike that the fans love to watch?
The first thing I'm going to do 100% is I'm going to change Cobble back to the old version, because what the hell is the new version?
Like, it's Halloween, dude. It's spooky.
I know. Honestly,
that's why.
The A site looks like someone just gave up on a bomb site halfway through making it. It's like some kid was given the opportunity to redo cobblestone, and he was like, just put like some logs there, and there you go. That's the bomb site. Like that makes no sense. So you revert cobblestone back, I think, and that's a map you can think about moving in and out of the pool. For me personally, I think 7 maps is the good amount. I think it's the nice amount to be able to have best of 3s, best of 5s, and not have to learn like 9 maps. That just feels too much to me from a pro's perspective. So I like 7 maps. I also think there are some maps that I'm absolutely switching up instantly, like Dust 2. I'm changing some stuff on Dust 2 for sure. For me, the thing that's so stale about Dust is those A-long battles are it's just like everyone throw flashbangs at the start of the round, and whoever's blind loses, and whoever's not blind wins. And because the Ts can put 5 players there, they can just bang 10 flashes out if they want to, and they don't have to get blinded themselves. So that's the issue I have with Dust 2. I think I'd make it so that the CTs can have a better ability to hold long, either by putting the Ts like further away so that they can't just instantly run out at the start, or maybe you put some more cover somewhere, or give the CTs another route, something like that. I think also short could change on Dust. I think it's a bit too easy for the Ts at times to just kind of jostle for position on that area. But as an overall concept for the maps, I think what Moses said on Counterpoints a while ago was he kind of liked to have the idea of changing bomb sites occasionally, just kind of slightly changing the layouts of maps. And as much as there are downsides to that, where maybe for a viewer it feels a bit weird if they haven't watched in a while and all of a sudden like the boxes on Dust 2 are all in different spots, that's going to feel weird. I get that. But I think it is a really good idea of a way to switch up some of the maps, specifically the maps that aren't as storied, I guess, in Counter-Strike. Like for Dust 2, okay, maybe you don't want to switch things up all the time because it is just like a fan favorite. But for some of the newer maps, yeah, maybe switch up some of the boxes on the site, switch up maybe just 1 or 2 areas of the map. I actually think that could have a really big impact in how these maps are played. So that's something I would probably look at doing, and trying to make sure that it actually changed the map. Not too much, but enough where it just keeps it exciting for the pros, right? Especially in this online era, it would be kind of nice just to have these occasional switch ups every now and then. Like once every few months, one map gets switched up slightly, and all of a sudden there's a bit of excitement back, I think.
You have given me an idea. And as you said earlier, coming up with an idea out of nowhere, without really fully planning it or thinking it along, it opens you up to YouTube comment attacks. But this is my channel and I need the engagement. So I'm going to go for it. And I'm going to say, how about you have multiple variants of the same bomb site? For example, Inferno B, and you've got different variants where things are swapped out, and you've got like, B1, B2, B3, we'll say 3. There's 3 different variants of Inferno B bomb site. And now we put that into the veto. So one team vetoes B1 and the other team vetoes B3, and then you get stuck with B2 or something to that extent. Maybe whoever picks T side gets to pick one bomb side, and whoever picks CT side gets to pick another. Would you say that would be a way to, like, the big problem with changing it up all the time that I've seen, like the counter argument to the point that Moses was making, is that at some point it feels like you're changing it for the sake of change, and it's not really about a tactical thing. Not asking you to grade my particular idea, but what do you think about like finding a way to make teams a little bit more responsible for the state of the map, and then you can also like maybe draw storylines from that, like, oh, on Dust 2 A3, this team is really good at like taking this particular control, and you almost want to make that, like, make sure you veto it if you're going against those guys. Like, would that add sufficient customization and change up the map in a way that's controlled, so it's not like endlessly variant, it's not always going to change and always going to be like a a balance update out of StarCraft 2 or something where they're just like changing units entirely or whatever? Would it be something that would be a little bit more approachable, do you think, or what do you think of that idea?
I like where your head's at. I think the instant problem teams would definitely have is if there are so many different like sites on every single map.
Yes,
that would
true.
be pretty hard to crack for.
Oh, yeah, and of course the lower tier teams, I mean, they can't even submit their vetoes ahead of time half the time. So good luck actually getting them to fill everything else out. So that there is, like you said earlier, you don't always go for those ideas, because somebody in YouTube comments will definitely have something to say about them. But you got to take your shots, so that's fine. I did want to ask about your Brawlin video. You referenced it earlier, and one of the things that I found was kind of interesting and ties back into our whole meta conversation about the economy is the fact that he was going for these aggressive peaks, and you were like keeping track of who was going for first duels, especially on the CT side, who was being aggressive in that sense. Do you think this is a reflection of the deny the plant meta, where you're trying to make sure that the Ts can't get that extra money from planting the bomb and further money fuck you on CT side? Do you think it has something to do with a situation where it's just like a play style thing? Is there a little bit of option A and option B? What would your take be on, like, when it comes to how these players or these teams are sending these players out and trying to be more aggressive or less aggressive? Do you think that is just play style, or has it got something to do with the meta itself?
I think it's probably partly due to the meta, definitely, but I think it's partly just for the specific players. A lot of the times it is spot dependent and kind of map dependent. So I think on Train, for example, you do see quite a lot of executes onto the A site, and you saw in quite a few of those rounds because Brolan was pushed in pop and he was really good at knowing when to peak. He was able to deny a lot of those execs onto the A site. Like, he was able to maybe just get one kill and just be there, and that's enough, right? Just being in that spot completely can throw off the game plan at times. And I think even in that video I was talking about, you saw Brolan specifically like adapt mid-game. He went from going for a lot of pop dog aggression, which started not working because Astralis was so focused on pop in that game. They were trying to take pop in every round. So he switched it up and he started pushing T main instead, where there was only one player holding basically every round. And he got away with that a couple of times. So I think it can even be matchup dependent. Specifically on Train, I will say you do see quite a few of those sorts of execs into the A site. And the other thing with Train is, over at Ivy especially, it's very easy for your Ivy player just to get smoked off or just to be in a spot where he kind of has to concede the control. And then you almost need to either be aggressive and in a position where you're not exposed from that, or you need to be as far back as possible in like Connector or Heaven or something where you're not just going to die from it straight up. So I think that's specifically why Brolan was making those sorts of plays a lot. As for just an overall idea of which players are playing aggressively, something that I actually tweeted out recently is I would really love if HLTV could put up the CT-sided and the T-sided stats overall on specific maps for the last 3 months or 6 months or whatever. Because they do it on the match page itself, but you can't actually filter overall by who's the best rated CT player on Mirage in the last 3 months. Right? Because then I could specifically look, and if I know exactly which players are the B-site anchors on Mirage, I could look and say, this guy's the highest rated B-site Mirage anchor player. Let's look at what he's doing. That's something I'd love to have, because that would be so valuable. And that's something where Counter-Strike has so much more room for these stats to come through. Unfortunately, I'm just not smart enough to know how to get like stats from demos and all that sort of stuff. So I think there's a lot more that can be done there with looking at specific spots. Who's the highest rated player in this spot, right? Is this player actually not great, or is it just the CT spots he's put in is why his rating is so low? I feel that there's a lot more that can be done there.
I wanted to also ask, since we're talking about CT aggression, and anytime you mention aggression, you got to bring up Furia again, even though we already did it earlier. I wanted to ask about something because it slipped my mind when we were initially discussing them. Is, of course, there's that famous round. Maui Snake recently had a breakdown on his channel of his favorite Furia round, where they actually exec onto the B-bomb site as CTs, which is, of course, hilarious, and of course, gets all the headlines once again, but there's a deeper tactical reason. I think he summarized it very well in his video to why they did it, what the pre-existing conditions had to be. The stars had to align in a certain way to make that a particularly viable strategy. Now, obviously, there's not really anything to that extreme level, I would imagine, that slipped under the radar. But are there examples of extreme CT aggression in a way that has tried to tip the scales in a different kind of way? Like, even before you get into a broken round or a 4v5 or somebody's got a man advantage, it's 5v5, early rounds, a gun round or something like that. Is there an example that you can think of where, one team really finds opportunities, like creates these opportunities for themselves to get that advantage in an unorthodox manner or an overly aggressive manner? Is there anything that springs to mind when we're talking about something like that?
I think for me, normally, I don't know if I always see it as teams, except for with Furia. A lot of the times I see it with specific players, though, like
Right.
Bubsky when he was playing his games on Astralis. Yeah, he was pushing like Pop Dog a lot, right? He was doing the same sorts of things. So I think it normally comes more down to specific players on specific maps in their spots. Normally, that's where I see the CT aggression coming from more often. Again, though, for CT play in general, I personally, as someone who's come and has like this poker background, I honestly think that sometimes I'm watching these teams play, like on Inferno, for example. A lot of teams are struggling now on CT side. As much as this sounds dumb, I do genuinely think you maybe should have like one round a half where you actually just 5-stack a bomb site. I know it sounds really stupid, but I honestly think that in terms of overall strategy, like having that once a half, I mean, firstly, that's going to rattle your opponents. Let's be real. If they run into a 5-stack, they're going to be mad on a gun round. But we are also seeing lots of saves already on Inferno. So there are scenarios, I think, where there are still things that could be experimented with for sure. And again, I hope for going forward, we're going to see more of that from Heroic, because I think Hunda might have some stuff up his sleeve, once he comes back, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing, is the obvious joke to make there is, Astralis running into a Heroic 5-stack. I thought Valve fixed the coach bug. What happened here? So obviously want to avoid that if possible. But I do think that there's something to be said, especially when you're trying to like conserve as much money as possible. And if you are going to be like half buying or partial or even full saving, there's an obvious option where, we've only brought one gun into the, from the last round. Let's just, gamble A or gamble B. Certainly something that could work, especially on maps like Inferno, where, like you say, there's already a lot of saving going on in that kind of map environment anyway. A lot of the bomb sites can be rather difficult to retake if you don't, have any conserved utility. And it's a map that's easy to throw away all your utility on. So there's a lot of compounding factors there. And I wanted to also ask, and this is something that's a bit more of a historical question, but I know you've been following the scene long enough to give us a good answer here. No pressure, of course. But I did want to ask about Nuke specifically, because this is a map that was famous for having, CT, incredibly skewed CT balance, like much more in favor of CTs than Ts. Yet we're seeing a lot more, and seemingly without significant map changes, we are seeing a lot more of an advantage Ts, or at least like even ground between the two. And maybe this is also a matchup dependent thing too. Like it could be that some teams are really good at preserving the narrative of CT dominance on that map. But what would you say has been the biggest fundamental change that has skewed the way that Nuke is now perceived, where a lot of teams are saying, oh yeah, we can just do this? Like, is it some sort of meta defining thing like the economy, or is it something like teams have developed new strats with utility that has allowed the Ts themselves to get a little bit more of an advantage? Have counter-terrorists just been losing out on certain opportunities? What's your take on the way that Nuke has unfolded in 2020?
Firstly, I feel like I quickly have to say, with my 5-stack thing I was talking about earlier on Inferno, for example, I do quickly want to point out, I wouldn't suggest just stacking 5 at the start of the round, right?
Oh, yeah,
like you are still
yeah.
going to have Dene Banana. I feel like I have to point that out, otherwise someone is going to completely wreck me for it.
No, that's fair, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the problem I have is I am already very different to how I thought about the game even like a year ago, right? So if I'm going back like a few years ago, I was such a different person back then. Like I look back on some of my videos a year or two ago, and there's so much that I think about differently. So for me, I think when I was watching maybe like 4 or 5 years ago was when I first started watching Counter Strike. I was watching so much more as a casual back then. So I never really was that kind of intensely into the game when Nuke was that CT sided. I would generally just watch for fun. So I can't really specifically compare, I don't think. I do think in general that the thing with Nuke that's been helping the T's a lot is just outside control has been so improved by teams now. Firstly, with the smokes to go down secret, and that already instantly forces the CTs to react. And then secondly, you can do it to wrap into heaven, and you can see teams that can start to take this outside control really effectively, just kind of force the CTs into really uncomfortable spots. They kind of start to encroach upon them like a snake almost, right? Just starting to strangle out its prey, getting all the map control. And that's where the CTs realize, like, we can't just get flanked from heaven. We have to try and do something like push lobby, for example. You see more and more of those rounds come down now. So I think that's the main thing is Ts have realized that they can just kind of slowly take map control, force the CTs into rotations. And then a lot of the times, specifically for teams that don't practice Nuke that much, those rotations are really hard to nail down, right? Like even when you just do the standard secret smokes, go down secret, the CTs instantly have to think, how do we respond to this? Do we put a player down vents? Well, he can kind of get stuck in the vents. If he's not there quick enough, that might not be the best. Do we rotate our ramp guy off? We don't know where the lurker is. Maybe he's sitting at ramp and he's kind of ready to make the most of that. There's just a lot that the CTs have to do where it feels like they oftentimes have to be on the back foot just with how the Ts are playing now. And that inherently is going to give the Ts opportunities, I think.
As we're coming to the close of this interview, one of the things that I wanted to touch on is something that you brought up just a few answers back, which is, of course, stats and how they can be used to inform narratives. And obviously, this is something that we talked about at the very beginning of the episode, but I wanted to ask, you mentioned that there's examples of content where if we had the stats, if we had access to some of these things that could help start the questions being asked in the first place to make the content that people would be interested in, then we would have more content of that kind, and perhaps we would draw in some more fans. What are some examples of content that we can already make with the stats we already have that you just don't see happening as much as should be, or maybe at all? Are there any examples of content that is just conspicuously absent in this current environment?
Not that it's conspicuously absent, but there is so much you can go into on HLTV already. That's something I should say, is that even though there are some small things that I'm looking at and saying, it just seems obvious to me that you should add this. Like we can look at the players' overall ratings. Why can't we look at their CT and T ratings? To me, that just seems obvious. But there's still so much you can look at. Like I think something that I've thought about potentially doing recently is stuff to do with flashes. There's so much stuff to do with flashes, flash assists. You can look at specific maps and see whose flashbangs are most effective. What kind of flashes are they throwing? If anything, I'm thinking right now, there's some pretty good clickbait there, right? Like the best pro at flashing on this map. Maybe I'll have to do that at some point. But there's lots of other stuff as well. Like you can go on a specific player and see when he gets the opening kill, how often his team win the round. You can do stuff like that. So you could say, wow, this team win the round 95% of the time or whatever when this guy gets the first kill. There's a lot of stats you can go into, and you can maybe just look at the stat and ask yourself, okay, why is this the way it is? And you can answer that in a video. And that's what I'm trying to do with my content, at least. I think there's a lot more room for it to be done. I also think something I have to say is that sometimes the answers you get aren't going to be satisfying. Like on my complexity video, I looked and I was like, wow, complexity are winning like 50% of their force spies. Wow, this must be really cool. They must be doing some really cool things. They weren't really. They were just kind of landing great shots and sticking together, which is all fine and dandy, but it's not exactly the analytical stuff that I want to be saying, right? There's only so many times I can say, wow, nice shot, Blame F. Nice shot, Config. Yes. Nice shot, Rush. I still think that video has value, though. Like, there are points you can bring from it. Like, complexity were specifically very good at having everyone contribute in those rounds, which is something I pointed out. And you can talk about overall concepts. But yeah, just in general, like literally, you can look at any stat on HLTV that you find that you think is weird or an outlier or something that stands out, and just look at some demos and try and explain what you see.
Are there any particular, I guess, tips or tricks you might suggest for anybody who's coming up in the analytical world and they want to make content sort of like yours in a similar vein where they're breaking down certain pro elements, or maybe just some examples of gameplay? What would you have to say to the up and comers in the scene who want to reach for the stars like you guys have?
I guess try and firstly, I would say try and always think about something from the player and the team's perspective. A lot of the times, I really try not to overreach and overthink things, because sometimes you don't know if someone has communicated something that's just wrong, right? Like someone might pull out a Glock and try and get the kill, and you might be thinking, why has he done that? And then maybe he just accidentally got the call that the guy was low when he wasn't, right? So there's something to be said for trying not to go too far with things, because sometimes you can try and make assumptions, but you can't know 100%. So that's the first thing I would say is make sure that you're not overreaching. Make sure that if you are pointing out something that you think is very specific, at least say to people, hey, this might not be right, but this is what I think is probably going on here. That's the first thing I'd say. Secondly, the most important thing, if you want to try and get clicks on your videos, is unfortunately the marketing. For the longest time, I made videos where I didn't really clickbait them because I don't really like that. You just have to play the game, though, unfortunately. The way that YouTube works, it literally is however many people click your video and how long the view time is. That's what will make them recommend your videos. So try and market them in a somewhat interesting way. You can do that inherently, though, because you're probably already asking an interesting question. So you can kind of just put that as the title of the video if you want. And then the third thing is, I would say try and have something about your content that is slightly unique. And I would say for me, like I try and incorporate those stats slightly because I think that's a strength that I have. I did a little bit of stat stuff at uni, which has kind of helped me with that. I think Launders has his kind of unique slice in that he goes through a whole demo talking about it with all his experience. And then some of the up and comers are doing the same thing. I think something that Mahone is specifically very good at is looking specifically at a spot from the pros player's perspective and saying, these are the nades they're throwing. This is what they're doing. And this is something you can try and take into your game, right? That's what I would say is try and have like something slightly different, slightly unique to you. It doesn't have to be anything crazy, just something that's going to get people intrigued and get people engaged.
And as a lasting question here, I did want to ask about the reception to such videos, just sort of your psychology when it comes to dealing with those YouTube commenters who poke holes in your 1 minute long, 1 minute old theories, like we talked about earlier. Do you have any particular like sort of, I guess, experiences you could call them, where you've seen comments that have been particularly helpful, or is it mostly just like the state of it is sort of an endless scree? I've heard both sides to the story, so I'm not sure which side you come down on. I'm hoping that maybe what ends up happening generally is in analytical videos is that people are interested in that content for a reason, so they'll comment something more insightful or more helpful. But what's your impression been when it comes to like reception of the content, and how do you handle dealing with some of the more negative content or comments that come out of that sort of experience?
I think I've been pretty lucky in a sense that the size my channel is right now, I get maybe like 10,000 views a video on average, I would say, at least on my recent uploads. Before that, I was getting like maybe 500 to 1,000 views a video. It wasn't anything massive. I think at that sort of size, you're not going to get too many bad comments. Mostly it's just people saying, hey, I enjoyed this, keep it up. Or, hey, I enjoy these videos. It's helped me in my gameplay. And normally for me, it's just been nice comments. There's a couple of times where people are just going to disagree, or I've had people say, oh man, someone said something on Reddit that was pretty harsh. I can't remember what it was. I think it was something along the lines of, there's no substance in this video. It's all just clickbait. And like, yeah, that's fine. Like that person is entitled to their own opinion. My content's not for everyone. I kind of just sit back and think to myself, if they've not enjoyed it, I can live with that. There are plenty of people that have enjoyed it. Like to begin with, especially, I got really caught up in comments, especially when I started casting. I remember a Malta event in 2018. There was a round where I think it was Taco threw a nade into pit on Inferno and got a kill with it. But this was before it had added players dying to the bomb explosion in the kill feed in the top right. So me and my co-caster, we didn't notice it because the camera was elsewhere. We didn't notice this guy dying. And oh my God, the Reddit comments at the time, as someone who was kind of still at university and still finding themselves in esports, that was a real sad moment, I guess, for me, in that I was like, yeah, I'm commentating this really big tournament. I'm talking to all these big casters. Like, that was my first time where I was like, wow, something's really, really going well for me here. And then brought straight back to earth with all those bad Reddit comments. But as you just do this more and more, you kind of realize, look, people are going to have their opinion. If anything, the fact that they have some sort of opinion on you is actually a good thing. The worst thing you can do is just leave someone with nothing, because at least if you just be yourself and just make videos that you like and just say whatever you want to say, some people are going to not like it. And I've started to realize it's okay if some people don't like you, right? That's just the way life is.
Is it because we is from Brazil? I mean, come on now. I mean, no, I guess I can't really be surprised.
They've been really nice on that art video, especially. They're very nice in the comments. I will give them that.
Okay, well, the Furia fans seem to be of a different breed. You know, like they're not really the same level of Coralho as the people from Semi-Pr0, at least from an outsider's perspective. So, well, that's heartwarming, at least that you've figured out a way to sort of deal with that, because obviously that's something that especially commentators, especially in that world, some of them are. Well, let's just say they go on these binges where they'll read comments as far as their their choice of entertainment, and dubious as to how the mental health ramifications are for that sort of thing. So wish them well in that regard for sure. But yeah, that pretty much does it for the interview. I don't know if you have any topics that we didn't touch on that you were curious about or wanted to talk about, or if you have any final words, generally speaking, feel free to plug anything or shout anything out.
I mean, we could have talked more about the casting if we wanted to, but I think it's also fine not to, because honestly, a lot of the questions around casting are normally just, how do I get into casting? It's like, okay, well, I can answer that, but that's not great. As
a general note on that topic, I should mention, this is something that I've like fallen prey to in the past too. And lately it's like, how do I get into interviewing? How do I get into any of this? It's like, well, if you don't already start doing something, you're not going to find out the answer anyway. Like, somebody else's answer probably isn't going to match up one-to-one with your life and be able to fill all the holes there. So if there is a particular thought that you have on commentating that has been on your mind, feel free to share, because I am, of course, interested in how like the recent commentating stuff that you did at DreamHack has gone, generally speaking. Like, I don't know how many events you've done recently before that. I don't think it's been too many. So I guess as a sort of layup in this particular sense, how was the experience going back into it?
Yeah, I mean, a DreamHack is always great because you're actually casting a decent level of Counter-Strike. I've had to cast so many bad games. I will say, if anyone is actually interested in how do I get into casting, it is a bit more difficult now. But for me, the way I got into it is grinding the hell out of open qualifiers to begin with. I think that's a great way of building up your casting ability, getting some eyeballs on your casting as well, and using it as practice to begin with. For me, that was so helpful. And there were countless like Friday nights, Saturday nights when I was at uni where it was, I'm not going to go out and do anything. I'm going to sit in and I'm going to cast like 9 hours of this open qualifier and try and just try and get viewers on it, because I really enjoyed doing it. So, but that's what I'd say is just start doing it somehow if you can, is honestly the best advice. Because from there, you'll probably just meet like-minded people. And worst case scenario, you'll make some friends, right? And best case scenario, who knows? It can just kind of take off. So yeah, there's not much I have to say in terms of casting. Just casting DreamHack's been really fun. I've done a couple of decent sized events in the past as well. Like, a lot of it has just been online work, though. You have to be ready to grind for sure. I also have to say as well, shout out to eFrag for never paying me for my first casting gig. Good old eFrag. I feel like every caster has a good story with eFrag not paying them. I think I was owed like $1,000 from them, which added up over a long time when I was at uni. That was kind of sad to not get that money, but I knew they had that shady rep. I kind of knew I should not rely on this money coming in. But luckily, every other TO I've ever worked with has paid really, really well. So that's nice.
Well, maybe they just took the typical 90-day period that it takes for talent to get their money, and they extended it to 900 days, 9,000 days. Yeah, you might get it eventually. You never know. We can start a petition or something. I was curious actually about something that I've thought about when it comes to getting into commentating generally, is how you decide on your duo partners, right? Because CS is notorious for generally people prefer when there's two voices, at least two voices, so that you can get a little bit of balance, so that one can prioritize the action, the play-by-play, and the other one can break down the round. Is this something that you had to deal with? Sort of just like whoever was available at the time? Was the tournament, pairing decided by the organizer itself in the early days? Like, what was the come up, experience like figuring out your duo partners?
Yeah, especially to begin with, casting online, it was just whoever they already had, I'd normally just cast with. But I was pretty lucky in that the way I got into casting was through the ECS Caster Challenge to begin with. So my story is I took part in the ECS Caster Challenge first time round. I was terrible. I did not win. I did it the second time round. I was a little bit better. I got an honorable mention, which was nice. Third time round, I finally won it. It was a great experience. And more importantly, I guess, it basically pushed me into casting with the person I cast with most now, Dinko. We met there. We both thought we were pretty good, and we both just kind of stuck together. And I've done a lot with him, so I've been pretty lucky in that sense, where I've done quite a few decent sized events. Like when I've done Cologne B stream, it's been with him. New York B stream was with him. Like normally, if I can just pick, I'll pick him because I think we're both pretty solid. So I've been lucky in that sense. There are a lot of casters out there that have that issue though, right? Of finding that person. So that's someone hopefully you could ask to someone else. But for me, so far at least, I've been pretty lucky in that I've just stuck with Dinko and it's gone pretty well.
You know what you have reminded me of is, since you mentioned Dinko, I did see a very interesting tweet of his where he mentioned that you had finally found out that the AK-47 was a good weapon. Do you have anything to say for yourself as a Dirty Krieg user for all of these years? Did it actually take Valve nerfing the gun into the ground for you to decide that it was worth picking something else up?
Yeah, absolutely. So the worst thing about this is one of my friends jokingly told me when we started playing the game that all the pros and everyone uses the SG. And so I started learning the SG. I was like, oh, this is what all the pros do. This is what all the best players do. That's what I'll do. And then a few weeks later, he told me, oh, yeah, I was joking. And I'd already learned
some sort of CSGO version of the Lad Bible or something. Like, yeah,
I don't know. He was just absolutely mugging me off. So I stuck with the SG. And the funny thing is, I started playing in maybe 2014, 2015. So the entire time throughout my CS career, I had the busted SG, the OP as hell SG that all the pros started to realize was good like last year. And I was still terrible at the game. So that tells you about how good I am. The AK, though, I've got to say, it feels nice. The main thing is just the fire speed now on the SG is trash. It's just garbage. And especially in close range fights, there's so many you're going to lose. Like it's just useless at this point. And the other thing is, man, the AK has that slightly higher movement speed, which is actually really useful when you're trying to entry. So yeah, I admit I'm a dirty SG abuser. I have like 50k kills on my stat track SG, but hey, I'm not a player anymore. Well, I never was a player. I played on my uni team technically, but I was never any good. So that's why I stuck with the commentating, because clearly Counter-Strike playing, not for me.
Sounds like we should be giving you a little bit of clemency, similar to good old Robin over on FaZe. Dirty coach bug abuser, but he lost 16-1, so it's fine. He didn't really get anywhere, so it's all good. All right, well, I think that'll do it. We got an SG user in the chat here. It's Hawka, and yeah, if you have anything to plug or any final words, feel free to let him rep.
Check out the YouTube. You just search Hawka on YouTube. It'll probably come up, hopefully. Yeah, Twitter, whatever. You can follow me on all the socials. And I'm going to be casting DreamHack next week. I think it starts. That's been announced. So you can watch out for that as well if you want to see the casting. I think that's pretty much it, though. Obviously, thanks to you for having me. It's been a fun chat. I feel like we've gone to a lot of places and I've enjoyed it a lot. I think this is the first actual interview I've done that's going to be released. So that'll be nice. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for your time.